All right, everybody. So I just got an email that some people are having issues accessing this. So I'm going to do the intro, kick it off to our panelists, and then try to solve those tech issues on the back end. So welcome and thank you for joining us for another Roebling road trip. And a big thank you to everyone who made a donation. So since the pandemic, we've been really trying to offer all of our virtual programs as pay what you wish so that we can support our community and just make sure that everyone who's interested in our content can join us. So all donations of any amount really do help the museum host these great programs, as well as fulfill our mission, which is to collect and preserve Roebling's history. So intro of me, my name is Lynn Calamia, and I'm the executive director over at Roebling Museum. I started right before the pandemic, and I've been having a wonderful time learning about the town of Roebling, the people who lived in it, and the people who currently live in it. So these virtual programs, especially tonight, they've all been a really big help in teaching me about Roebling's history, and then also allowing us to get this greater national perspective on Roebling's impact. So for those of you who haven't visited yet, Roebling Museum, it's located in the former company town of Roebling, New Jersey, which is located in central New Jersey, right on the Delaware River. The company town is a historic district, and it was built in 1905. And I like to say it's about 98% intact. So one big building burned down and another one was moved. So it's really an amazing little time capsule, definitely a hidden gem. So the museum itself is actually in one of the former steel mill and wire rope buildings that used to be on the property, and the mill and the wire rope mill, they produced materials needed to build some of the United States' most iconic suspension bridges, but also other things, as we will learn today. I was telling our panelists I'm so excited to have a non-bridge talk for once, and this is going to be a really good example of what the wire rope has been used for beyond just the suspension bridge story, which is really important. Love the bridges too. So today we're going to go on a Roebling road trip, and for those of you who are first timers, welcome. Roebling Road Trip is a virtual program that's been taking our audience around the country to visit with people at Roebling sites outside of the New Jersey area. So we've been to Cincinnati, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, Saxonburg, the town founded by Roebling, the Brooklyn Bridge, and more. So if anybody else has ideas about where we should go next and what you'd like to hear, please email me, or you can even submit them as questions so that I can get those on my list. Our next one, mark this down on your calendars, is July 13th. And there's a Roebling Bridge in Maine that we're going to hear about. So that one should be fantastic. Tonight, the way that the program's going to run is our guests will give their presentation, and while they're talking, please feel free to submit questions as soon as they come to you, because I'll be on the back end managing the questions and then asking them to our presenters once they're finished with their talk. So without further ado, if you guys want to get started.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's really, really great to be here. My name is Salmaan Khan. I am one of the co-founders of People for the Pavilion. I will, a nonprofit organization that advocates for the preservation and reuse of the New York State Pavilion in Flushing Meadows, Queens. And I will let my esteemed colleagues, Aaron and Justin, introduce themselves as well.
Aaron,
Justin, please go first. No, I'm gonna go.
No, because I'm talking first. So you go, and then I'll intro, and then I'll talk.
All right. Well, okay. Aaron Asis. I actually have the privilege of working with both organizations as a artist in residence for Untapped New York and for People for Pavilion. Also the pleasure of knowing Justin and Salmaan for quite a while, and as a Flushing native, have a long-standing relationship with this structure. Most of my life, sound is echoing. I hope that's not me. Dominic, I'm gonna keep talking, keep barking in the chat if it's untenable, but had the privilege of growing up in Flushing near this structure, spent most of my childhood not fully understanding what it was, and most of my adulthood really admiring its history and its purpose, and feel very honored to share its story and also share its potential for the future with you. So it's a privilege to be here, and I will now kick it to Justin to introduce self and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Salmaan. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, everybody. I am a huge Roebling nerd. I have been talking about the Roebling family for years up here in New York, doing Brooklyn Bridge tours. I'm going to vote, Lynn, for Cold Spring. If you haven't been there on a road trip yet, go up there. It's got lots of great Emily Roebling history. But my name is Justin Rivers. I'm Chief Experience Officer with the online magazine and experience company called Untapped New York. And Untapped New York was founded in 2009 as Untapped Cities. And our whole idea behind founding was rediscover your city, which was at that point New York, still is New York. We have a lot of work to do. And of course, one of the most iconic structures in New York is the Roebling structure, the Brooklyn Bridge. But most of the bridges in New York lend themselves to Roebling technology and obviously this pavilion as well. My job is to create experiences not only for the public, but also for our membership program, which is known as the Untapped Insiders, who join us for a monthly subscription, and we take them all around once a week, virtually and in person, to insider and behind the scenes tours and access in New York. So I have a really awesome job, and one of my awesome jobs is to do our virtual programming as well with Untapped. So I'm going to get started because I am the history and background guy for you. And Aaron and I actually do a World's Fair tour roughly about once a month. It was Aaron, as a Flushing native, who got me out to Flushing and said, we need to talk about this. And so I'm actually going to start at the beginning. I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible, but the terraforming that made Flushing Meadow Corona Park is quite amazing. And as you see on this first slide, Flushing Meadow was not a natural park. Although you walk there now and you think it might, it was one of the world's largest ash heaps at the time. What you are looking at in this slide is what they called Mount Corona, because it was technically in the town of Corona. It was 100 feet of ash. How did this ash get there? Well, this ash was actually brought in by a developer by the name of Michael Degnan, who wanted to turn the Flushing Bay and Flushing Meadow into an industrial port on par with sort of, think Elizabeth, New Jersey. He himself had actually worked with the Williamsburg Bridge and the Cape Cod Canal and thought he could get lightning to strike 3 times in Flushing Meadow. So what he did was he got into a contract with a Brooklyn refuse company, and all of the commercial, residential, and industrial ash from furnaces, coal burning furnaces mainly, were brought up on the Long Island Railroad out to Flushing area in Corona and dumped on a daily basis for almost 3 decades. And this is what you see now. I don't know if you noticed it, but there is a little gentleman on the top of Mount Corona. It was one of the highest points in Queens at the time. Salmaan, you can go to the next slide. This is what Corona, Queens looked like. And in the background, all the way in sort of the top, middle, and left of your screen is what will become Flushing Meadow. That's Roosevelt Avenue. It almost looks like a little town in the Wild West. And it was at this point that a burgeoning new parks commissioner by the name of Robert Moses, who I'll talk about a couple of times, was building his Grand Central Parkway. For those of you who know New York and know Long Island, you know the Grand Central. It is an essential way out to Long Island or to LaGuardia Airport. And he comes to these ash dumps and he goes, you know what, we need to clear these, because in Robert Moses's very young, very hungry mind, he was going to turn this area into the largest park in New York, and he would hope that it would bear his name one day. So what happens is he needs to find the funds to do this. And the funds come from the idea that they were going to use federal money to create a World's Fairground, because they were going to, in 1939, celebrate the 150th anniversary of George Washington being inaugurated the first president of the United States in New York. So that's a mouthful. And of course, it was a big excuse to get money to terraform. Salmaan, you can go to the next slide. So there you can see our mayor at the time, the little flower. He was such a wee man on the site as they were removing on a daily basis thousands of people day and night in shifts working to remove all of the ash and basically turn it into a fresh start there over at Flushing Meadow. And the idea was to bring in hundreds of thousands of trees, 5 million shrubs, and most importantly, they needed to create firm foundation to put pavilions on the fairgrounds. So in the next slide, what you will see is, I just included this for fun. This was sort of the space age field operations house that was on Flushing Meadow. By the way, a very important thing I had neglected to tell you, I apologize, was that if you ever want to know how iconic or infamous the ash dumps, where all you have to do is read Epcot's Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, because the Valley of Ashes is the Corona ash dumps. Fitzgerald was working and living in Flushing for a while as he was writing that book. But back to this. So to create firm land, because Flushing Meadow was a tidal estuary marsh, you needed to sink these, what you're seeing, a line of Douglas timber firs, which were creosoted and put into the ground. This is going to be an issue we will talk about when we talk about the construction of the pavilion in a couple of minutes. Next slide is going to show you what that ground looks like when they cut those timbers and they sink them. You can see already the water table is trying to reclaim itself. It's sandy, it's marshy. This made it complicated to use this as parkland, but Moses and the Fair Corporation would not be deterred. Now, in Roebling history, what was interesting is at this time in the late 1930s, the Roebling Company was very high profile still because of the Golden Gate Bridge, which had just wrapped up construction. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, being big Roebling fans at the Roebling Museum, that Roebling steel rope had found itself in most of the major bridges in the United States in some way or another, or the technology that the Roeblings had begun. So the Roebling Company was invited, or actually they signed a contract to be part of the first World's Fair, 1939 and 40. And as you can see here, they were going to be housed in the Pavilion of Metals. So the other thing that you will notice is they were going to be showing wire rope, insulated wire cables, flat wires, wire screening, netting, and welding wires as part of their exhibit. But I know that the Roebling Museum actually also, I think recently, or in the past couple of years, did a exhibit of the paintings of the bridges that had Roebling wire in it, which were gorgeous paintings that were at the World's Fair. And of course, Lynn, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but I saw some of those paintings. They're beautiful. So in the next slide, you will see this is the hall of metals that the Roebling Company was at in the 39-40 World's Fair. You also notice in the background, that was theme center for the first World's Fair, the Trilon and Perisphere, which was a very impressive spherical and tower-like structure, which will be replaced in the second World's Fair with the Unisphere, which we know. And the next slide is going to show you what the fairgrounds look like. It was an incredible terraforming project. It required a conduit, which created two lakes on the other side of the Grand Central that were not there. It was just a creek. And of course, hundreds of pavilions, temporary structures to be built for the 39 and 40 World's Fair. Now, here's the problem. The problem was the World's Fair Corporation had assumed that this World's Fair was going to be a huge hit financially. Robert Moses was banking on it. And what Robert Moses's plan was to take the revenue from the first World's Fair and convert the park into Robert Moses Park. I'll talk a little bit about more Robert Moses's background when we get to him in about 2 slides. So Salmaan, you can go to the next slide. This is what happens. Basically, because of the Depression and the beginning of World War II, the fair is an abysmal financial failure. Both seasons, 39 was even worse than 40. 39 was so bad that they had to redo the theme of the fair to make it sort of kind of a futuristic country fair and get people to come just to sort of escape. The first one was considered to be too high-minded. Nobody had any money. Some of the pavilions were left to rot. And Robert Moses, for years, as he gained more power in other institutions in New York, was still trying to figure out a way to repurpose this park and make money to turn it into his great park. And then you fast forward to, there it is. Robert Moses's plan was, let's hope round 2 goes better than round 1 does. And oh, by the way, I can just use the fairground layout that I did for the first. So Robert Moses in 1960, who you have to understand if you don't know anything about Robert Moses, by 1960, he was the most powerful person in New York City. He had acquired power by making himself head of a Triborough Commission, which collected money off of the tolls of the Triborough Bridge and many other highways. He was Parks Commissioner. He was also head of the Power Commission in New York, which we'll see in a couple of slides. And he, we don't have to go forward yet, Salmaan, that's fine. He took over as president of the World's Fair Corporation in 1960, which gave him the highest salary of any city employee, even leaps and bounds more than the mayor was making. And now he's starting to get a really bad reputation as a bully, as somebody who's bulldozing neighborhoods to build his highways, and also somebody who pushed a second World's Fair idea when it wasn't even blessed as a World's Fair by the International Exhibition Bureau. But the idea was, and Salmaan, you can go to the next slide now, that New York State was always going to get the best pavilion at the World's Fair. And that required an architect of quite some standing. And who you're seeing here is Philip Johnson, who was picked at the time. Philip Johnson had a lot of cachet. He was the director of the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York. And he was a big proponent of Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, who were the two very famous modern architects at the time. Now, in tandem at the same time, Moses is going to be working with Rockefeller to make sure that, and there they are together at throwing the switch at the Niagara Power Project, because again, nobody was more powerful than Moses. His project spanned the entire state. And if you've ever...
sorry to interrupt. I got to jump in about this photo.
Please
I'm pretty
do.
sure they hated each other.
Oh, they
But
hated each other.
You look at this photo and you think these two are the best buds that are so excited, but they cannot stand each other.
Oh, they could not. And, you know, Moses couldn't stand anybody, and Rockefeller couldn't wait to take this guy down. And actually, Rockefeller had a really great opportunity because of the World's Fair, because his image was really being put through the muck for the World's Fair. And for those of you who know New York very well, I'll just tell it now briefly, Salmaan, because you said that.
Yeah.
Robert Moses had intended to be part of Rockefeller's great experiment, which was the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which runs all of the public transportation in the state of New York, and most of all of the public transportation in the New York tri-state area, in New York, Connecticut, Metro North. And Rockefeller did not even invite him to be an honorary board member. And Moses was crushed because of that. He sort of tucked his tail out and moved out to Long Island and lived in sort of shame because of it. But at this point, Nelson Rockefeller really wanted to make an impression with the New York State Pavilion. And the intention was it was going to be a permanent gift to the state of New York and the city of New York.
Justin, I don't want to harp on this image, but
yes, please. Go ahead.
Hard because it's like two power brokers with the word power behind them flipping a switch who cannot stand each other. If you could find a better representative photo of these two, I don't think it exists, but I just had to point that out.
No, I agree. I totally agree. It is a great photo, and it's one I hadn't seen, Salmaan. When you put it in this presentation, I was like, oh my God, I love this. You could do a presentation on Rockefeller and Moses and the way that they sort of cat and mouse each other in a lot of ways. Now, the reason why Moses wanted to do a second fair was because this was really the state of Flushing Meadows Corona Park. This is the IRT, what is now known as the 7 line to us. It was known as the 7 back then. Yard. This place was a mess, and there was really no money to clean it up. So again, Moses wanted to use funds to create a second World's Fair. So now we go into building the second World's Fair ground and the New York State Pavilion. And here's Moses. Moses now is president of the fair, chief cook and bottle washing, this whole thing taking over. You'll notice in the background that Shea Stadium going up on his right side. Shea Stadium was also a permanent gift in an attempt to give the new team that had been created, the New York Mets, after the Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers had left for the West Coast, a new home. And again, these were all huge ego projects for Moses. He's standing in front of the Unisphere, which is the largest representation of the planet Earth on planet Earth, still to this day, which was, again, Moses had more pictures in front of the Unisphere than anybody else because he loved the idea of this thing. And of course, again, the New York State Pavilion would be one of the largest on there. Now, Johnson's idea behind, no, the Ford Pavilion is over on the other side of the highway. Sorry, I just saw that come up. So next slide, Salmaan. Here is the beginning of the construction of the New York State Pavilion. And the idea behind it was Johnson wanted, as he said, quote, an unengaged free space as an example of the greatness of New York rather than a warehouse full of exhibit material. All these World Fair pavilions sort of went out of their way to figure out how to display their wares. If it was companies, they had gimmicks, pen pals, all these sort of things that you could do to engage with the company, to buy products from the company. States and countries were showing the best of their country through different exhibits. New York State really wanted a different type of pavilion, open air. It was created with 16 hollow cylindrical slip cast concrete columns. They were 16 feet, measuring 12 by 8 feet in diameter and 100 feet in height. Here you can see them forming. These pillars that were going to hold up, and this is where Roebling comes in, a suspension roof. And this was something that was a real mind blower architecturally at the time. The roof itself was a marvel. And as you can see here, and for those of you who've seen it or remember the pavilion or have gone recently to Flushing Meadow, you think to yourself, how did they get this gigantic axe-like bicycle spoke up there? Well, they built it in pieces on the ground and hoisted it up. And what they did was they created the largest at the time suspension bicycle roof using Roebling technology for the suspender cables that held the roof up. The roof measures at 320 feet by 240 feet. It had an outer steel compression ring and an inner steel tension ring, which you're actually seeing at the bottom left-hand corner here. And that ring and those cables are still there today. What's not there was probably one of the most beautiful facets of this pavilion, which was the roof itself, which I think we're going to see a couple pictures of in a minute. But again, in most of the pictures of Moses, I think we've got another one, Salmaan, right? Yeah, you'll see in the background, here's Moses. And in the background, what you're seeing is the most definable feature of the fair, besides the Unisphere, is going to be the New York State Pavilion. There was another pavilion, the United States Pavilion, also intended to be permanent, but that did not wear very well. And by the late 1970s, they had decided to destroy it. The next slide shows you, again, the grandeur of the pavilion itself. Now, I keep talking about the pavilion, but the pavilion had 3 parts to it, which is probably should be talked about. Those towers that you see rising in the background, those were the observation towers. Those were a real hit for the fair because there were 3 different observation decks that you could go up into. The large oval-like structure, which I've continued to refer to just as the pavilion, was called the Tent of Tomorrow. And then there was a third component known as Theaterama. And Theaterama was a 380-degree theatrical experience where you could experience scenes of New York in sort of a partially open air type theater. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things I'll just mention before we go on to the fair quickly was that 26 wooden piles, again, were driven into the earth to form a foundation for the pavilion. And they were topped with a 4-foot thick concrete pile cap on top of it. Now, the problem was, unlike the first fair, those 26 piles were not creosoted, and they were subject to rot because of the rising water table, which is one of the restoration challenges of the pavilion now, is to sort of figure out how to shore up that mezzanine ring, which I believe either Aaron or Salmaan will talk to you a little bit more about. But Salmaan, you can go to the next slide. So now here was its presence in the fair. Here is how Robert Moses reused, the biggest recycling project in New York was reusing the fairgrounds from 40 and turning it into another fairgrounds in 64, 68. By the way, high nerdery. If you look at the layout of this fairground, you may notice something. It was designed by Gilmore Clark, who was the architectural landscaping architect of Moses. Moses loved him, and his stuff is all over New York City. And he actually referenced the Vatican in laying out this park. And as you can see, the Unisphere is theme center, which would be like St. Peter's Basilica. And then everything sort of radiates out from theme center there. And that was reused twice. And you can see in the back top right corner, there is the pavilion again, sort of rising above all. If you read articles, of course, if you have memories of the fair yourself, the pavilion was actually used as a way to navigate the fairground because it was so tall with those observation towers in the background. Now, here's, the beauty of this structure was that suspension roof. And one of the reasons why was there was 1,500 multicolored fiberglass tiles that sort of diffused the sun into different light. That light was cast down onto a gorgeous Texaco map of New York State that was done in terrazzo, which I think we have a picture of towards the end of my presentation. And of course, the observation towers were a big hit. And there were three of them. The highest was 226 feet. The middle was 181 feet, I believe. And the one closest to the ground was 85 feet. And that one, I believe, had concessions on it. And each one were designed to give you a full view of the fairgrounds and even parts of Queens and over into Manhattan as well. And at night, the idea was those panels lit up, absolutely gorgeous shots of the pavilion during the fair. And here's the deal. The fair was not, the New York State Pavilion had open programming. And that was one of the things. The idea behind the pavilion was a place to see somebody perform, a place to take a rest if you were, sort of tired of walking around the fairgrounds. They had tables set up. They had concessions inside. If you know somebody who lived in New York and was in a marching band or in a chorus in one of the high schools in the tri-state area, chances are they came and played in this. My aunt and I have a great a second or third cousin who played in the pavilion. And this was a place to come and be in awe, not only of the architecture, but also of the structure and the map. My favorite story about the Texaco map, which maybe Aaron was going to tell, but maybe I might steal it, is that if you didn't see your town on the Texaco New York State map, you could write to Texaco and they would actually replace the panel and put the name of the town in there. One thing to mention before I turn it over to Salmaan, I believe, to talk about some of the protests and post fairs and I think we're going to talk about the art too, Salmaan, before I hand it over, is that the pavilion was the most celebrated architecturally on the site by people who knew their architecture at the time. Vincent Scully basically said that everything at the fair wasn't architecture, it was pretty much garbage, except the pavilion was pretty good. It was great, good fun, as he called it. Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the architectural critic for the New York Times, said that it was carnival with class, that she really, really thought it rose above both physically and architecturally all of the other structures. And again, I keep saying that because it all ties into the roof and it all ties into the suspension, the idea of the suspension roof. Interestingly enough, it was Johnson who was calling upon a dying architectural 10-year spout of what was called Googie architecture or Gucci architecture. Probably one of the most famous examples of Gucci architecture was Charles Luckman's LAX flying saucer building. All of these Jetson-like architectural pieces, I believe the Space Needle probably falls under it as well. And people did not love it and they thought it was going to be great, but that's what the 10 to Tomorrow sort of was in also reference to. And I think you've got one, Salmaan, a really amazing shot of the roof from above. I mean, just absolutely beautiful. We could just Google it. It's one of the things that when I'm at the fairgrounds doing a tour, I can't even begin to imagine what it would look like, because as you'll see coming up in subsequent slides, it was removed and Aaron will tell you why.
It's really hard to find photos like
it really is.
Prepping for this.
Good job.
It's the only good photo I've ever found of the.
It's really an amazing photo. Both Aaron and I, when we were reviewing the deck with you, were like, "Holy crap!" And I've seen a lot of photos of the pavilion. I think the last thing I'm supposed to talk about is the art, right? Oh, there are the observation
the towers. Yeah,
also,
there's just different images. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful buildings. I already gave you the heights on them, but again, they really were absolute beautiful architectural nods there, and so much so that they revived themselves in Men in Black. Obviously that was fake, those were not real. I think everything about the pavilion in Men in Black was not true, but like locally, and of course they were not spaceships, but really just absolute standouts. You can see them from almost any part of the park, and people clamored to get there. That rocket, and I don't think we have a really good picture of it, but the red rocket elevator was also a really cool component of the towers as well. And the towers are currently right now getting electrified. I know you're going to talk about it and repainted, and I'm really excited about that because the 10th of tomorrow acts has been. And of course, here are some of the views that you could get from the tower, looking on what was pretty much considered to be an abysmal architectural failure. Also financial failure, by the way, once again, but I think probably Salmaan will get into that a little later. And the monorail. The people are still obsessed with that monorail today, which was actually on the other side of the highway for the amusement zone by the lake as a way to get around. I'm sure a lot of you know this.
Yeah.
One of the biggest names at the fair, he had his hand in 5 pavilions, was Walt Disney. And Walt Disney was very inspired by this fair, as we're talking about the monorail, as we know, monorail at Disney World. And very much a part of negotiating with Robert Moses to put the next Disney park in Flushing Meadows Corona Park until his advisor said, "Are you crazy? It's Queens. It's seasonally awful and traffic." So he went to Orlando instead. But just think about that. There's that map. Again,
Yeah.
And I know I'm not going to say much about the map. Again, I told you this story. I know we're going to talk about the map in a little bit as well, with what's going on is and all that stuff. So just, it's a great shot of the map, and I'll leave it at that. And then lastly, because of Philip Johnson's involvement with MoMA, he used Theaterama's surface as a gallery to highlight all of the up and coming modern artists that were New York based. And of course, this is Roy Lichtenstein. And Roy was very much a hit at the fair. And I know Salmaan is going to tell you now about one of the great scandals of the fair with a very famous pop artist at the time, Andy Warhol. So Salmaan, I think it's time for you now.
I think, thank you, Justin. Justin's far and away the most knowledgeable about any of this. So we say from here on out, it's going to pale in comparison. But this is really where the reality of what was happening in America comes up against the sort of fantasy world that was being produced by the fair. So you see here the Theaterama with the Lichtenstein piece on it. But here's a few other pieces by famous artists. Who is that? Florida? I'm forgetting the name of the Eat person. But all very extremely famous artists on the side, including a good guy named Andy Warhol, who put up a piece called 13 Most Wanted, which was a bridge too far for the people of the fair. So they covered it up because it was too sort of aggressive, negative. The idea of the fair was this fantasy of, everything being really great and beautiful in the future. The theme was peace through understanding, but you got to keep in mind, this is 1964. It's America probably at one of its most tense moments. And
Salmaan, can I just, I'm sorry,
please,
I promise
please.
to shut up after this, but the one story I love about 18 Most Wanted is the idea behind it was Warhol wanted to create a mural with the mugshots of the FBI's 18 Most Wanted at that year. And 80% of them, I believe it was, were Italian American. And Moses said, "Oh, we can't offend the Italian American community by doing this," which is why it got covered up. This from the man who actually deliberately spelled the name Verrazano wrong on the Verrazano Bridge because he was pissed he had to name it after Verrazano because he wanted to name it after John F. Kennedy.
Didn't Warhol try to
Robert
get back at him?
What?
I think Warhol wanted to get back at him by using his face for a similar piece of art.
And he did. And yeah, that's immortalized at the entrance to Flushing Meadow. Okay, go Salmaan. Sorry.
No, please interrupt because you've got way more knowledge about this stuff than we do. Lyndon Johnson, I believe this is the opening of the fair, and there was all these sort of high-profile politicians and visitors. But as I mentioned, this is the daughter of the then vice presidential candidate for Barry Goldwater, I believe, who was a volunteer at the fair, Libby Miller. And you can see the inside of the pavilion there. But this is a very tense moment, and an organization called CORE, which was the Congress for Racial Equity decided that what they wanted to do was to use it as an example and to basically shut it down with the biggest traffic jam the city had ever seen, until they got a number of items, including equality in education and housing and other similar things that they were trying to get, basically by leveraging the sort of presumed popularity of the World's Fair. And there was, here's the demands on the left from CORE and how to participate. They wanted employment, slum housing, schools, and police brutality addressed, or they were going to basically shut down access to the fair, which was significantly attended through vehicle traffic. So they were just going to close it. So on the bottom there, it says how you're going to do it. Put your car on exhibit any way you see fit. Run out of gas. Stop, check your engine, fix a flat. Basically, to just slow everything down. And you can see there's a series of photos we were able to find of protests that were happening the opening day at the New York State Pavilion with people being carried out. This is a great one of someone from ABC with a camera trying to interview this woman who's being carried out of the pavilion. You can see Theaterama in the background, which was the Queen's Theater. And yeah, you can see that the fair was just completely at odds with the reality of what was happening in America. It was a complete fantasy, and it was, as Justin mentioned, we're sort of financially unsuccessful once again, but it really did sort of try to propose this world that didn't quite exist. And as Justin also mentioned, this wasn't an officially sanctioned fair. Most countries were not sort of represented here, and it was primarily an economically focused fair. So you had a lot of companies selling stuff rather than countries sort of showing what they were going for. And you can see the newspapers were not particularly, I would say, on the side of this group, but heave ho, come to the fair. 2 civil rights demonstrators who sought to dim the glitter of the New York World's Fair opening are assisted from the premises by special police detail. So it was not a successful protest in the sense that they did not shut down the fair in any way, but this was, I believe, just a few months before the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. So it was very prescient for the time, and sort of raising awareness of the things that were happening in the country at the time. So I want to hand it off to Aaron here to talk a little bit about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the fair.
And this is an interesting part of the history of the story too. There's been a lot of references to the fair itself, the contrast and the tension between what the fair was trying to represent and the political tensions in the country. But one of the inevitable realities is, the financial state and kind of the physical state of New York City in the 70s and 80s, which is, was immediately following the fair itself. I'll talk about that in just a second, but this is just kind of a, go back one second.
Oh, sorry.
No, but it's just kind of a striking image of the fairgrounds itself once all the pavilions were removed, and you just have a couple of the permanent structures still remaining, Terrace on the Park on the right, and then the pavilion in the background, the highway kind of piercing through, and in the immediate center on the left is the building that's now the Queen's Museum. That was actually one of the original buildings for the '39 World's Fair. But the fairgrounds, architecturally significant or not, were much more packed solid in the earlier images than they are here. Still, the pavilion was always designed to be a permanent structure and was designed to host programs and events, which it did actively from '64 until about 1970. Some significant performances, musical performances, including Led Zeppelin performed there in 1969. Now I'm ready to move on. But one of my favorite life after the fair stories of the pavilion, that's a little known fact, is that it was used as a roller skating rink for 2 or 3 years. And there's a lot of reference to the terrazzo floor, both as being a significant icon for fairgoers themselves, larger than life opportunity to stand on top of a map and find your town. In a few slides, we're going to see the current state of the terrazzo floor, which is unfortunate. But one of the myths that I want to dispel here is when they converted the pavilion into a roller skating rink, the roller skating didn't damage the floor in any way, shape, or form. It actually it served a purpose in preserving the floor. They had to lay down several layers of poly down on the ground to create a smooth skating surface. So they actually encased it with a protectant, so to speak. And what cooler function to cruise around the pavilion than to roller skate for a few years. So it was a couple out of Cleveland, Ohio. They came through had 2 or 3 seasons with concessions and New Yorkers kind of coming into this place, open air on all sides, roof still intact, and just skating around to their heart's content. Jackets in this picture show that it was even late in the season, it was an attraction. I wish I was alive then to roller skate in there at the time. It sounds like one of the coolest things that I would have loved to have done. Obviously never had the chance to, but it's a really fun story. And if you're ever in Queens and wandering around the fair itself or the pavilion itself, you can still find one old sign that says roller skating rink that's very faded. But if you really want to geek out and look for that, you can confirm these photos are real by finding that sign on the post. A couple of images here of the skate rental tickets, another image of the skating inside itself, and then a ticket stub from some of the musical performances. And I think Led Zeppelin's actually on this. It is on this one. So this was just a musical festival of the pavilion representation of that. And we've definitely come across people who have nothing but good memories and stories to tell. Well, what little that they can remember of that show, but they like to speak about it fondly. I think though, one of the stories, I'm going to do this a little sequence to talk about the USTA coming into the fairgrounds. Justin had mentioned the United States Pavilion being one of the structures that was designed to be permanent, came down, but ultimately became the grounds for Arthur Ashe Stadium. And the USTA obviously serves a function there for decades now as the US Tennis Open on the grounds, not necessarily life after the fair for the pavilion, but definitely life after the fair for the park. The two most significant attractions there still are the Queens Museum and the USTA. And the park has really become, both in the 70s and even still today, is an open green space for unprogrammed use. So that's one of the things that's really significant. Again, much more today than maybe in the 70s or 80s, but really becomes kind of the backgrounds for all the surrounding neighborhoods in Queens. And I think this photo here, I'm not exactly, I wish I had the privilege of, again, being able to ride these trolleys around town, but trolley cars running on top of the repurposed, the street grid is still there. If there's ever going to be a third World's Fair, they'll probably just recycle it all again. But you see the observation tower still in the background. And then, this is just kind of a really, really cool image of the pavilion from above with a very well-timed airplane shadow right in the center of it. But looking at this photo relative to the photos we've seen so far, you're going to notice that the fiber panel roof is missing. And this is kind of like my prompt to tell the story about what happened, why it's missing, how unfortunate that it's missing. And one of the unfortunate things is in 1973, when the roller skating rink was still operating, the Parks Department that owns and operates the pavilion started to notice that some of the panels were coming loose. So roller skating operators were trying to secure them by whatever means necessary. Ultimately, the Parks Department considered it too big a liability to renew their contract for occupancy. With a very heavy hand, went in and literally knocked all of the panels out, didn't remove them, but just knocked them out onto the ground, which caused damage to the floor, left it open to the elements, which just really kind of left the floor and the whole entire building to the mercy of the elements. Really unfortunate, kind of this image in 1981, but it really started in 1973, 1974 was kind of the downward spiral of the pavilion as an occupiable structure and something that was well cared for. The next photo is one where we start to get into the aesthetic of what I think most people kind of view as the pavilion. Roebling is still very much intact still today. But this is a view from one of those observation towers looking down before the floor had been really, really damaged, but still was kind of an interesting space to kind of cruise through. Our good friend Phil Bueller, Salmaan, I think, took this picture.
Yeah.
Good guy. I might tell a story about him later if I remember. But the pavilion still inspired interest. It still inspired this guy to ride his bike through, Richard to do an art installation inside the pavilion. Again, floor panels still reasonably intact, but the tent itself, the structure itself, it kind of embodied this energy. It held this energy. It still attracted people to it and through it. I would argue even still today, it is an icon and a magnet for people to come up to it. People don't necessarily know why they're drawn to it or what it was, myself included for a lot of years, but it still has this lure and this aura about it, which I think all of the components kind of work in a perfect dance together to really, really evoke that feeling. And this installation kind of does the same. It just sort of plays off that spirit and invites people in. Into the more contemporary state of now, I think the color of rust yellow on the top is something that is very commonly branded into people's memories of the structure. It definitely looks like it hasn't been occupied for a long time, but it has avoided removal. It's dodged the sort of wrecking ball for multiple decades. And I think without stepping too much into the end piece of the conversation here, there were definitely moments where the pavilion was very near destruction, and it's survived, I think, both just kind of like the fate of its spirit, I think by the fate of public interest, I think just by the fate of timing, and just by ingenuity, architecture, and creativity. It definitely has the bones to stand, but the fact that it's still around is really quite a significant thing. This image, I think, is a really important one because now we start to see the stripes, the red stripes on the bottom starting to reappear. The battle axes have been repainted, American cheese yellow. Paint is just paint, I understand that, but what paint really does on a building like this is it expresses and it really communicates to people that this is not just a blight that's being left alone, but there is attention being paid for it, and there is a future that, though it's not yet determined, is being considered. So when you start to put attention back into these structures, in any way, shape, or form, the public persona and public perception, both from just passersby and also from administrators, bureaucrats, and everybody up and down the avenue of people involved, it changes their perception of what might be possible in the future.
I will say that paint also does protect. Steel, a union had actually donated time and materials to paint this portion of the structure, which will go a long way towards protecting it from rust in the future. So it's great.
And it was a bridge painters union, I think. So I think, paint protecting rust, bridge painters union, I think it's worth mentioning in a Roebling presentation in Bridgeland, but there are definitely parallels to the structure, though it's not a bridge in type, and not just to do with the tension cables, but there's a lot of bridge parallels here. Couple of contemporary references. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what this image is. I looked at it in the presentation. I meant to ask you guys, but I know the next.
This is the most iconic sort of modern representation, which is Men in Black.
Come on, I was going to say Men in Black.
Unbelievable.
Okay. I know the next one's The Wiz. That is Men in Black.
Yeah, then it was used in The Wiz, famously, which it really was a beautiful sort of use of the facility in the I think, what was it, late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, 80. I thought it was 78 or 81. I might be wrong because now my foot is all in my mouth. And of course that was Will Smith. I'm sorry. That's my
Well, the point is that it lived on in the popular culture in this very strange way where it was sort of like hidden within these references. There's They Might Be Giants music video from, I think, the early 90s, late 80s, Don't Let's Start, where you can see the structure itself and the map floor. But yeah, this is Aaron, I can let you wrap up this part of what the terrazzo floor looks like today.
Yeah. So I mean, this is technically it's covered in gravel now as a protectant, but this is basically the last condition that it was exposed to the elements in. There was a push to preserve it, definitely a partnership with University of Pennsylvania. They removed a couple of panels and went through the process of trying to treat them and trying to see what it would take to bring them back to life. Certainly possible, but very unrealistic due to the significant cost it would take for 478 panels to be recreated. So here it is covered in gravel as sort of a barrier to protect the state that it's in, to just not let it deteriorate anymore. But still, the condition, this photo is a little bit older than the photo before. Obviously the paint is on the battle axes and inside is a little bit more upkept, but pavilion is still not occupiable to the general public, though the significant structure is well intact. The secondary structure, the mezzanine, is a little bit more questionable, but the permanence, or at least the footing that was put underneath the 16 concrete columns is well to do. And I've been heard through the grapevine from some of the engineering people that they don't really have an immediate or 50-year concern about the integrity of the superstructure.
I want to be conscious of time here because I think we've got only about 10 minutes left. So I think we could go through the next few relatively quickly. This terrible photo is actually one that I took about 2011, where I got the opportunity to go up to the towers and take a look down and take a look at what it looks like to walk up the staircases inside of the columns. The steps were in bad shape then. They're in even worse shape now.
They're not even there anymore.
Yeah, I'd be remiss without mentioning the New York State Pavilion paint crew, who have been for years sort of making sure that the inside and the outside were kept up a little bit with paint and bringing sort of the luster and life back to the structure.
And Salmaan, I want to just chime in for 1 second, because the pavilion, the paint guys, it's all volunteer time, volunteer materials. So sometimes things at a scale of preserving a structure, they come from the blood, sweat, and tear of volunteers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go through these very quickly. This is sort of where the New York State People for the Pavilion comes in. This is we just did a number of programs in various parts of Queens to just get people engaged and excited to learn about what it is. Everybody recognizes it. Nobody knows what it is. So we just wanted to sort of get people engaged. This is us in Forest Hills at one of our programs. Those two actually got into a huge argument. She wanted to tear it down and he thought that was ridiculous. But starting a conversation, getting people interested in it. That we did a competition a few years ago, and we supplemented that with public programs. This is us in the Queens Museum. We had a 3D representation of the pavilion and helped people to sort of come up with ideas of what's the wildest thing they could think it could be. No holds barred, no rules. And we went around to different neighborhoods, and I didn't even see. I'm there on the right. Just getting people excited, getting people interested, and getting people engaged about what this thing is and what it could be in the future. We partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation on that, and it was really successful. We got over 250 submissions from around the world. Got to meet with the Queensborough president. The gentleman on the right is Mitch, who is one of the paint crew folks, and the guy in the blue is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And there's just so much excitement around the structure and the future of it. So I'll just go through some of the submissions we received. This one was the New York State Pavilion Ecology Center, repurposing it for ecology purposes. My favorite one, the New York Whales Pavilion, just put a spot for people to take a look at whales. I guess, I don't know where this came from. Community garden, this one's really beautiful, really engaging. I thought this was gonna win for sure. This one's really cool, just sort of a repurposing it as a really cool sort of funky new thing. The Queen's Beacon, using it as a calling, sort of a calling for Queens and connecting the tent structure to the towers. This one would be reimagining it by basically treading around it. So you leave it as it is, but you've given people an opportunity to sort of go around it and see it as a ruin. This was the biggest one for some reason. Don't ask me why. The Cheeseburger Museum. This ended up in New York Magazine. I was absolutely furious that of all the things we did, this got more sort of attention than anything else. I don't even want to look at it. And this was the winning one, the Hanging Meadows. Just a really beautiful, incredibly thoughtful sort of reimagining of what this structure could be. We had a jury from around the city, and we had great. Paul Goldberger was in the jury. Deborah Burke, architect from Yale, and community members, and we culminated. There's Paul Goldberger on the left. It culminated with a exhibit at the Queens Museum, which was really great. They were incredible partners. And finally, more recently, that's former Parks Commissioner Mitchell Silver, the groundbreaking a couple of years ago to do some renovation work on the structure itself. And then finally, the last slide here is sort of where we're at, which is the Parks Department has been going through the capital process to do some upgrades, including some concrete work, as Justin mentioned, I think some electrical work, and they want to light it. So there's funding allocated, the work is in progress. What it's going to be is still very much TBD, but there's a lot of support behind it, a lot of excitement, and a part of the funding is there. You can see that they've got 25 million in funding. They had a few years ago, I think, put the estimated around $75 million to bring this thing back up to what it once was. That number today is probably, I don't know, a trillion, who knows, but I think we're in the right direction, and it's a very exciting moment to have followed it to this point and see where it is now. So with that, I thank you. Sorry to rush us through the end there, but I want to be conscious of time with about 6 minutes left here.
I feel like that was my fault. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not at all.
I did a lot of. Can I open Q&A with a trivia question, which I am going to throw 2 free tickets to an Untapped New York tour if somebody gets the answer in the chat, because I think this is a really interesting homage not only to the pavilion but also to Roebling and suspension technology. Does anybody want to guess in the chat what other New York structure is directly influenced by the New York State Pavilion? Almost directly, and built slightly after the pavilion. Put it in the chat. Anybody know?
Are we allowed to play?
No, because you're probably gonna be giving the tour with me.
I don't know. I don't know the answer. Yeah. Oh, I think I do know the answer.
Is that
All right,
it?
let me look at the chat.
And Jordan,
All
I feel
right,
like.
Chris, you got it first. Chris Sweet, 2 tickets to any Untapped New York tour that you'd like. Well, you can connect with me through Lynn if you want, or I can put my address in the
That's
chat
Chris.
while I'm done. But yes, Madison Square Garden, when it was designed by Charles Luckman, and Charles Luckman was in and out of. Oh, thank you, Chris. I'll take that down. Was in and out of influence with Philip Johnson, and of course the iconic structure of Madison Square Garden is its inverted suspension roof, which has 48 bridge-like steel cables in it. And the reason why Madison Square Garden did it was so that there were no pillars obstructing the view, because Madison Square Garden 3, that's the 4th one, people complained they couldn't see because of the support structures holding the roof up. So, Chris, you could join Aaron and I on a New York World's Fair tour. There's one coming up at the end of June. I'll email you, Chris. Congratulations.
Okay, we do have a question though, so I'm going to start with that. What size ropes or strands were used to support the roof, and how are they protected from the elements? Was it just open when it was up? You don't have to know the actual diameter of the ropes. I feel like I'm supposed to know the answer to that,
Way to
but I don't. Someone in
the-
the chat, I'm sure, knows the real answer. Like the
Stump the
deep
panel on
Roebling
question
girths.
1.
But what was it open, or did it have a roof? I think I've seen pictures where it was semi-covered.
Yeah, the
Back
fiberglass
up.
panels, I
Yeah.
don't know what the connection method was, but I believe the fiberglass panels might have concealed, or at least had the Roebling cables run through them.
Mhm.
Because I know that there are definitely stories, but when they were becoming loose, it was all about readhering or fastening the panels themselves to those cables. So I think
Yeah, and the cables are pretty much weatherproof in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
considering they're out on bridges
But
without
there's-
coverings.
but there are multiple layers of cables. There are some of the more significant cables that run at a different angle, and then there's all of the interstitial ones that run into the center spoke. So they don't all run on the same layer. So there's a little bit of three-dimensionality to the way the cables splay.
So another question that came in was whether the Roebling family, I believe, was still operating the company in 1964, and that is a no. The Roebling company sold the company to Colorado Fuel and Iron in, I want to say 53. I should have that number really, because 53. So before this was built, but it was still operating under the name of Roebling. So for all intents and purposes, people would have seen it as a Roebling project. Is the National Trust providing funding for the current project for preservation?
They are not. They provided
Not yet.
Not yet. They provided an amount of funding, but it's a little bit. They didn't provide like long-term capital funding, if that's the question. It's funded by the city. So the Queensborough President Melinda Katz provided a significant amount of funding at the outset. And the city council and the former mayor, I believe, also allocated some money, which brought us up to the amount we have today.
So their funding was more like visioning, right? That was
Correct.
for that project.
Yeah.
The cheeseburgers.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. They helped support the ideas competition and other programs as well.
I do want to speak to that though as a transformative public program. It's when you look at structures, and this applies to the pavilion specifically, but can apply to all kinds of structures, is going through an exercise of reimagining it and going through an exercise of doing it fantastically as an ideas competition was really critical in helping people see past the structure as just being this stagnant thing that either needs to be what it was or needs to go away. So I think, whether or not, National Trust for Historic Preservation or not, I think that was People for Pavilion, just the involvement in sort of reimagining or capturing the imagination of people again and allowing them to sort of reconnect with what the pavilion was initially designed to do, which was to be that sort of, liberator of fantasy for people and for gathering, I think was really significant.
We went to a ton of neighborhoods and did programs in the field, which was absolutely exhausting, but really really fun and really engaging, and got a lot of excitement.
All right, last question before we wrap up. This is from a woman named Lynn, spelled the same as mine. You gotta love that. Have you ever come across any pictures of the roof being put together with the panels and the cables?
If I had them, you would have seen them. I would have.
Yeah.
I'll have to find one. I'll look.
And I will
There-
say, just
The
because I'm looking,
construction photos are very hard to find.
Very, very hard to find.
I think Salmaan captured most of the ones that are,
I
out.
put everyone I've ever seen in this brief.
Yeah, you've got the full, I mean, actually, if you go back, or you go forward one, Salmaan, I think, right? Maybe, no, or back two, I'm sorry, now yeah, I mean, there you
Oh,
go,
yeah.
that's as close as you come.
Yeah. This is like a scan of a scan of a photocopy I found.
with no color, no detail.
Yeah.
I do want to respond to the question about restoring, or is there any talk?
Yeah.
I mean, there's been talk about everything, like anything you could possibly imagine, has been talked about. And obviously, things that have to do with restoration or reimagining as the structure that it was, tends to be significantly spoken about. So that's absolutely been conversational. Whether or not that'll happen, the funding will ever materialize, or what the future holds for it is anyone's guess.
I also would like to say that the Roebling element of the roof is very much alive and well today. I mean, it is the cables. So, and the cables are there, and they're a stunning part of the structure.
Yeah.
And that suspending ring, both rings are present. One is in really good condition, and the center tension ring is in really bad condition. But they're there, so they are alive and well. And actually, they get full sort of view and prominence because the fiberglass is not there.
Yeah.
But of course, we'd love to see the fiberglass back.
This is a good photo. You can see the depth. You can see how the cables don't all run on the same axis.
Right.
You look at it closely.
It's really beautiful.
Well, this has been fantastic. Now we're all going to go run out and visit and see it in a totally different way. And I'm just like, thank you guys for being involved with this kind of project and bringing it to all the different communities and really engaging the public with the revisioning, because it's on public property and it's for the people. So this is amazing.
Thank you. Go to Untapped Cities or nyspavilion.org and please reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, and if you ever need Roebling Museum to write you a letter of recommendation for a grant or you name it, I'm here for you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And everybody have a good night.
Bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye. Thanks, everybody.